All right, ready to dive in. Today we're tackling the Middle East, specifically the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Oh yeah, a rivalry that goes way deeper than just like oil and Islam.
Right, exactly. We're using this academic research paper to guide us, so think of this as like a deep dive.
Going beyond those headlines we always see.
Yeah, trying to figure out what's really going on, why these two powerhouses can't seem to get along, and you know what that means for everyone else?
And this paper uses a really interesting lens to look at it, the balance of power theory.
Balance of power. What's that all about?
Well, imagine like a constant tug of war. Each side's trying to make sure the other doesn't get too strong.
So, like, they need each other in a weird way to keep things in check.
You could definitely say there's some of that going on, but to really understand it, we got to rewind a bit before the 1979 Iranian Revolution.
Okay, back to the good old days, before things got messy.
Well, actually, things were pretty good between them back then. Both monarchies saw eye to eye on things like containing communism, and their economies were doing pretty well thanks to oil. Stability was a shared priority.
Stability. With all that oil money, you'd think they might have been tempted to, flex their muscles a bit.
And that's where the whole balance of power thing comes in. Think of it like a seesaw. Back then, Iraq under Saddam Hussein was another big player in the region.
Right, Saddam can't forget about him.
So even though Saudi Arabia and Iran were rivals, they also kind of needed each other to balance out Iraq's ambitions. It was a delicate dance, let me tell you.
Okay, starting to get the picture of this balancing act they had going on. Then boom, 1979, the Iranian Revolution changes everything.
It was a total game changer. The Shah of Iran, who was actually working with the Saudis, was out of there, and in comes Ayatollah Khomeini. This new Iran was a theocracy completely opposed to monarchies like Saudi Arabia and that revolutionary fervor. Man, it was spreading like wildfire.
Yeah, I can imagine that must have been pretty unnerving for the Saudis. Like your neighbor suddenly turns into your arch nemesis.
Exactly. They tried to find some common ground, but then the 1979 Grand Mosque seizure in Mecca just made things a million times worse.
Oh, yeah, that was a big deal, wasn't it?
Huge. Even though Iran denied any involvement, it created this huge wave of distrust and added a whole religious dimension to the rivalry.
So now it's not just politics, it's about faith, too. Man, this is getting complicated.
And then to top it all off, the Iran-Iraq War kicks off in 1980. Talk about adding fuel to the fire.
Oh, yeah, that was a major turning point, wasn't it?
It totally reshaped the region. Saudi Arabia saw Iraq, even under Saddam, as the lesser of two evils compared to revolutionary Iran. So they started pouring billions into supporting Iraq, essentially picking a side.
Hold on, wouldn't supporting a dictator like Saddam go against their whole stability thing? Seems kind of hypocritical.
Well, it's never black and white, is it? They saw it as a necessary evil to contain Iran's influence. It all goes back to that balance of power idea. Saudi Arabia was trying to keep Iran in check, prevent them from getting too powerful, but came at a cost, no doubt about it.
A risky gamble then. So they're playing the long game, making some tough choices along the way. And then you've got the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, forming around this time too, right?
Oh yeah, the GCC, that was a major development. Saudi Arabia bringing together allies, drawing a line in the sand against Iran.
So the GCC was like Saudi Arabia's power move then, a way to counter Iran's rising influence.
You could definitely see it that way, a way to solidify their position in the region during all this chaos.
Okay, so we've got a revolution, a war, a new alliance forming. What else did Saudi Arabia do to push back against Iran?
Well, they have one more card up their sleeve, and it was a big one: oil.
Oil. What did they do?
In the mid-'80s, they basically flooded the global market, driving prices way down. Now, obviously, this hurt a lot of countries, but it hit Iran particularly hard. Their economy was already struggling with the war and sanctions.
Wow, that's a power play if I've ever seen one, using oil as a weapon like that.
It definitely showed how far they were willing to go to achieve their goals, but it also deepened the resentment between them, making any kind of reconciliation even harder. And then 1987 happened.
1987, you're talking about the Mecca incident, right? That's mentioned in the research paper, but I don't know much about it.
It was during the Hajj pilgrimage, when millions of Muslims gather in Mecca. Well, a clash broke out between Iranian pilgrims and Saudi security forces. Hundreds of people died. It was a tragedy.
And of course, both sides blamed each other.
Naturally, it became a symbol of just how bitter the rivalry had become. Now, it wasn't just about political power. It was impacting the religious sphere, too, really driving a wedge between them.
So by the end of the 80s, they went from being somewhat friendly to sworn enemies. It doesn't sound like there's much hope for cooperation at this point.
It definitely looked bleak. But then, as things often do in the Middle East, the unexpected happened. The Iran-Iraq War ended, and then Saddam Hussein decided to invade Kuwait in 1990, totally changed the game.
Whoa, hold on. So now you're saying that Saudi Arabia and Iran suddenly have a common enemy. What happened next?
Well, it wasn't exactly a buddy-buddy situation, but they both realized that Saddam's aggression was a threat, and they both wanted stable oil prices, which the Gulf War was definitely messing with.
Oh, the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing, even if they still deeply distrust in each other.
Exactly. The Gulf War forced them to put their differences aside, at least for a little while. They didn't exactly fight side by side, but they both supported the U.S.-led coalition against Iraq.
That's wild. These two rivals who were practically at war themselves just a few years ago now finding common ground against a shared threat. But did this cooperation actually last beyond the Gulf War?
To a certain extent, yeah, diplomatic relations were restored in 1991 and things calmed down for a bit. But let's be real, this wasn't some grand love fest. The rivalry was still simmering under the surface.
So they were playing nice but still keeping an eye on each other. Sounds like a recipe for trouble down the line.
You got it. It was more like a temporary truce. Both countries had their own internal issues to deal with, and the world was changing after the Soviet Union collapsed. They both needed a breather, basically.
Okay, so the rivalry was on hold, not over. Makes sense, but I have a feeling this fragile peace didn't last forever.
You're right about that. The next big turning point came in 2003 with the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq. Remember that whole balance of power idea we talked about? Well, taking Saddam Hussein out of the picture threw everything off balance.
Yeah, like pulling a key piece out of a Jenga tower and just waiting for it to collapse.
Perfect analogy. Saddam, despite being a brutal dictator, had actually been keeping Iran in check. With him gone and Iraq in chaos, there was a power vacuum. And guess who was ready to fill it?
Iran, I'm guessing.
You got it. Iran's influence in Iraq grew rapidly, and that freaked out Saudi Arabia. They saw it as a direct threat to their own power and security.
So the U.S. intervention, which was supposed to bring stability, actually ended up making things worse for Saudi Arabia, the law of unintended consequences in action.
It happens all the time in foreign policy, and it just added more fuel to the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
So how did Saudi Arabia react to Iran's growing influence? Did they just sit back and watch?
No way. They weren't going down without a fight. They started supporting anti-Iranian groups in the region, got involved in an arms race, basically tried to counter Iran's every move.
So the rivalry was back on full force.
Oh, yeah. And then another layer of complexity was added: the Arab Spring uprisings in 2011. These popular movements across the Middle East demanding change, they really shook things up.
I remember the Arab Spring, but how does it tie into the Saudi-Iran rivalry?
Both countries saw it as a chance to push their own agendas, but in very different ways. Iran positioned themselves as supporters of the oppressed and backed groups that were challenging the established order, a lot of whom were aligned with Saudi Arabia. They saw an opportunity to weaken their rival and reshape the region.
So they were taking advantage of the chaos.
You could say that meanwhile, Saudi Arabia was terrified by the uprisings. They saw the Arab Spring as a threat to the way things were, potentially destabilizing monarchies, including their own. So they cracked down on dissent at home and intervened in neighboring countries to support friendly regimes.
Wow, talk about completely opposite reactions to the same event, each driven by their own fears and ambitions. Did this lead to a direct confrontation between them?
Not a full-blown military clash, but definitely a proxy war. They ended up supporting opposite sides in various conflicts that broke out during and after the Arab Spring, especially in Syria and Yemen. Those conflicts became battlegrounds for their rivalry, fueling violence and instability across the region.
It's tragic how their rivalry ended up making those other conflicts even worse, adding to the suffering of so many people.
Absolutely. Their struggle for power has had a devastating impact on the Middle East. And as you can imagine, the Arab Spring just made things worse between them. Any chance of reconciliation seemed further away than ever.
Okay, so we've got a rivalry that's deeply entrenched, constantly evolving and spilling over into multiple conflicts across the region, and it's a lot to process. What does this all mean for the average person? Why should we care about this power struggle happening on the other side of the world?
That's a great question. It's easy to think this is just a regional issue, but it actually has global implications. Remember, the Middle East is a vital source of energy for the world. Any instability there, especially involving these two major oil producers, can have ripple effects on the global economy.
Right, so higher gas prices, economic uncertainty, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of terrorism. The rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia creates an environment where extremist groups can thrive. They exploit the chaos and instability to recruit followers and launch attacks, not just in the Middle East, but potentially anywhere.
So this isn't just about oil and regional power, it's about our own security and well-being, too.
Absolutely. What happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. This rivalry has the potential to affect all of us, and understanding it is crucial if we want to navigate the challenges of the 21st century.
Okay, you've convinced me this is way bigger than I initially thought, but I'm also feeling a bit overwhelmed. Is there any hope for de-escalating this rivalry? Or are we doomed to witness more conflict and instability?
Well, the research paper does offer some insights into potential paths toward a more peaceful future. It's not going to be easy, but there are factors that could change things.
Okay, give me some hope here. What are these factors? Is there anything that could break this cycle of animosity?
It's definitely a tough question to answer, but there are some possibilities that we can explore.
Okay, so last time we left off with this unexpected twist, right? Saudi Arabia and Iran, these rivals suddenly finding themselves on the same side thanks to Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait.
Yeah, it's kind of like they both looked at Saddam and were like, okay, you're the bigger problem right now.
Exactly. But did this shared enemy actually lead to any real cooperation between them? Or was it just a temporary truce?
Well, it wasn't like they suddenly became best friends or anything. More like they recognized that their interests kind of lined up at that moment. They both really didn't want Saddam messing things up.
Especially when it came to oil prices, right?
Oh, yeah, the Gulf War was definitely throwing a wrench in things, and stable oil prices were in everyone's best interest at that point.
So it was a classic case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, even if they still didn't really trust each other deep down.
You got it. The Gulf War basically forced them to put their differences aside, at least temporarily. They didn't join forces on the battlefield or anything, but they both supported the U.S.-led coalition trying to push back against Iraq.
It's pretty mind-blowing to think about these two rivals who were practically on the verge of war themselves just a few years earlier now finding common cause against a shared threat. But did this newfound cooperation actually last beyond the Gulf War?
It did to some extent. Diplomatic relations were restored in 1991 and things were relatively calm for a while. But let's be real, this wasn't some kind of grand reconciliation. The rivalry was still simmering under the surface.
So they were playing nice on the surface, but still eyeing each other suspiciously. Sounds like a recipe for future trouble to me.
Yeah, I mean, it was more like a forced truce than a genuine change of heart. Both countries had their own internal issues to deal with. Plus, the world was in this weird transition phase after the Soviet Union collapsed. It was like everyone needed a moment to regroup.
Okay, so the rivalry was on pause, not over, I get it. But something tells me this fragile peace couldn't last forever.
You're reading the situation perfectly. The next major turning point came in 2003 with the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq. Remember that balance of power thing we talked about? Well, removing Saddam Hussein from the equation really threw everything off balance.
Yeah, it's like pulling out a crucial piece of a Jenga tower and then just waiting for the whole thing to wobble.
Exactly. Saddam, as brutal as he was, had actually been acting as a counterweight to Iran. With him gone and Iraq in chaos, it created this power vacuum. And you can probably guess who was in the best position to fill that vacuum.
Iran, right.
Bingo. Iran's influence in Iraq grew really quickly, and that sent alarm bells ringing in Saudi Arabia. They saw it as a direct threat to their own security and their dominance in the region.
So the U.S. intervention, which was supposed to make the Middle East more stable, actually ended up making things worse for Saudi Arabia. Talk about unintended consequences.
It happens all the time in foreign policy, right? The U.S. probably had good intentions, but they ended up destabilizing that delicate balance of power that had been keeping things relatively stable in the region. And of course, this just threw more fuel on the fire of the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
So how did Saudi Arabia react to Iran's growing influence? Did they just sit back and watch it happen?
Oh no, they weren't about to let Iran just run away with things. They ramped up their support for anti-Iranian groups in the region, started this kind of arms race, basically tried to counter Iran's moves at every turn.
So basically the rivalry was back on full blast.
Full blast is a good way to put it. And then to make things even more complicated, the Arab Spring uprisings happened in 2011. Remember those? Popular movements all across the Middle East demanding political and economic reforms.
Oh yeah, I remember the Arab Spring, but how does that tie into the Saudi-Iran rivalry?
Well, both countries saw it as an opportunity to advance their own interests, but in totally different ways. Iran presented themselves as champions of the oppressed, and they backed groups that were challenging the established order. A lot of those groups were aligned with Saudi Arabia, so Iran saw a chance to weaken their rival and potentially reshape the entire region.
So they were basically trying to capitalize on the chaos to their advantage.
In a way, yeah. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia was absolutely horrified by the Arab Spring. They saw it as a threat to the existing power structure, something that could destabilize monarchies like their own. So they responded by cracking down on dissent at home and intervening in neighboring countries to prop up regimes that were friendly to them.
Wow. Talk about completely opposite reactions to the same event, driven by their own fears and ambitions. Did this lead to a direct clash between them?
Not a direct military conflict, but definitely a proxy war. They ended up supporting opposite sides in a bunch of conflicts that erupted during and after the Arab Spring, especially in Syria and Yemen. Those conflicts basically became battlegrounds for their rivalry, fueling more violence and instability across the region.
It's really tragic how their rivalry ended up making those other conflicts even worse, adding to the suffering of millions of people.
Absolutely, their competition for power and influence has had a devastating impact on the Middle East. And as you can probably imagine, the Arab Spring just drove an even bigger wedge between them, making any kind of reconciliation seem almost impossible.
Okay, so by this point, we've got a rivalry that's deeply entrenched, constantly evolving and spilling over into multiple conflicts across the region. It's a lot to take in. But what does all this mean for the average person? Why should we care about this power struggle happening halfway across the world?
That's a really important question. It's easy to think of this as just a regional issue, but it actually has global implications. The Middle East is a vital source of energy for the whole world, right? So any instability there, especially involving these two major oil producers, can have a huge impact on the global economy.
Right, so things like higher gas prices, economic uncertainty, that kind of stuff.
Exactly. And then there's the whole issue of terrorism. The rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia creates this breeding ground for extremist groups. They exploit the chaos and instability to recruit followers and launch attacks, not just in the Middle East, but potentially anywhere in the world.
So it's not just about oil and regional power, it's about our own security and well-being, too.
Absolutely. What happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. This rivalry has the potential to affect all of us, and understanding it is crucial if we want to navigate the challenges of the 21st century.
Okay, I'm convinced this is way bigger than I initially realized, but I'm also feeling a little overwhelmed. Is there any hope for de-escalating this rivalry? Or are we just doomed to see more conflict and instability?
Well, the research paper we've been looking at actually offers some potential paths towards a more peaceful future. It definitely won't be easy, but there are factors that could potentially shift the dynamics of this rivalry.
Okay, so give me some hope here. What are these factors? Is there anything that could break this cycle of animosity?
Well, it's a complex situation for sure, but there are some possibilities that we can explore.
So we've spent the last two parts of this deep dive really getting into the weeds of this Saudi-Iran rivalry, huh?
Yeah, it's been quite the journey, hasn't it?
It has, and it seems like there's no easy solution, but I gotta ask, is there any hope for these two to actually, get along? Or at least stop trying to one-up each other all the time?
Well, the research paper does offer some glimmers of hope, but I'll be honest, it's going to take some pretty big shifts, either within the countries themselves or like on the world stage.
Okay, so let's start with those internal shifts. What could potentially change things from within?
Imagine this, a new generation of leaders comes to power in either Iran or Saudi Arabia. And these leaders, they're not so stuck in the past. They're not as tied to those old ideologies and historical baggage that have been fueling this rivalry for decades.
So basically, a leader who's willing to break the mold, someone who's more focused on the future than the past.
Exactly. Someone who sees the potential for cooperation. Someone who prioritizes things like economic development, internal reforms, maybe even regional cooperation instead of constantly trying to one-up the other guy.
Okay, I like the sound of that. But is that really realistic? I mean, we're talking about deeply entrenched systems here.
It's definitely a long shot. But hey, it's not unheard of. Remember Gorbachev in the Soviet Union? His reforms helped end the Cold War, and a lot of people thought that was impossible back then.
Right, good point. So you're saying a similar figure could emerge in either Iran or Saudi Arabia and shake things up?
It's possible, and that could create an opportunity for dialogue, for de-escalation, maybe even some kind of reconciliation down the line.
Okay, I'm holding on to that hope. But what about external factors? Could changes on the global stage play a role in pushing them towards peace?
Absolutely. The research paper actually emphasizes the role of the international community in this whole thing. Imagine sustained diplomatic pressure from major powers like the US, China, the EU, really urging both sides to sit down and talk to work out their differences.
So basically, the world acting as a mediator, trying to keep things from boiling over.
Exactly. And that could involve a lot of things like arms control agreements, economic incentives, maybe even joint infrastructure projects that benefit both countries.
So creating a situation where it's actually in their best interest to cooperate.
Exactly. And let's not forget the power of economic incentives. I mean, both countries are heavily reliant on oil revenues. If they realize the conflict is bad for business, well, that can be a powerful motivator for change.
It's like that saying, if you want to make peace, make trade.
Right, exactly. But let's be real for a second. It's pretty naive to think that economics can just magically erase all those deep-seated ideological and religious differences between them.
Right. Those are some pretty big hurdles to overcome.
No doubt about it. But the research paper does suggest some long-term strategies for addressing those deeper issues. One that really stood out to me was the idea of fostering more cultural exchange and people-to-people diplomacy.
Okay, what does that look like in practice?
Imagine more educational exchanges, joint research projects, maybe even tourism initiatives that encourage ordinary Iranians and Saudis to interact with each other. Break down those stereotypes, build bridges of understanding.
So basically humanizing the other and realizing that we have more in common than we might think?
Exactly. It's about fostering empathy and understanding at the grassroots level. And sure, it's not going to happen overnight, but over time, those kinds of interactions can create a foundation for better relations between the two governments.
That's a really interesting approach. It's not about ignoring the differences, but about finding ways to coexist despite them. But let's be realistic here. Given all the animosity and historical baggage, is there any real-world example of this kind of reconciliation actually working?
You know, there actually is. History's full of examples of bitter rivals who eventually found ways to overcome their differences. Look at France and Germany after World War II. I mean, they went from being sworn enemies to becoming the cornerstone of the European Union.
Wow, that's a pretty powerful example. So you're saying that even though the Saudi-Iran rivalry seems impossible to solve right now, there's still hope for a more peaceful future.
I'd say there's always hope. It's just going to take a lot of vision, courage, and a willingness to let go of the past, you know? It's going to require leadership from both sides, pressure from the international community, and most importantly, a commitment to dialogue and understanding from ordinary people.
It's a tall order, no doubt, but after this deep dive, I'm definitely convinced that it's worth striving for. The alternative is just too scary to even contemplate.
Couldn't agree more. The future of the Middle East and maybe even the world depends on whether these two rivals can find a way to move beyond their past and build a more peaceful future.
Well said. It's been a fascinating and honestly pretty sobering look at this complex rivalry, but it's also been a reminder that the future isn't set in stone. We have the power to shape it through our choices and actions.
Exactly. And hopefully this deep dive has given our listeners a better understanding of what's at stake and why it matters to all of us.
I hope so too. Thanks for joining us on this journey and for sharing your insights.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a more peaceful and just world. That's all for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.